All right, welcome to the Aspen Ideas Festival. And before we begin, I just want to do a little survey. So if everyone in the room, can you raise your hand if you live in Colorado? And, oh, wow. Okay, and then keep them up. Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, Wyoming, California, Nevada, Mexico. Okay, and then raise your hand if you've had lettuce, or raise your hand if you had a salad last winter that contained lettuce. All right, so look around the room, keep your hands up.
Oh, wait, I did too, sorry.
All right, so a salad that contains lettuce. And that means that almost every single one of us in here relies on the Colorado River, which is the topic of discussion. So welcome to Where the Water Goes, the next 100 years on the Colorado River. Thank you to Aspen Ideas Festival for including this as an important topic. And my name's Tilly Walton. I'm host of a PBS TV show called Wild Rivers with Tilly. And I fell in love with the river when I was 19. And I became a river guide and a hydrologist, and it led to a whole career of environmental planning and then philanthropy and river conservation. So absolutely thrilled to be here with these incredible experts. And Jennifer and John have basically eat, breathe, and sleep the Colorado River. And so I'm going to let each of them introduce themselves.
I'll start. My name is Jennifer Pitt, and I'm the Colorado River Program Director for the National Audubon Society, which is a national environmental group that, are we okay on the mic? Okay. A national environmental group that has as its mission protecting birds and the places that they need to survive. And we view that if you're taking care of the birds, you're probably taking care of the people too. So my Colorado River story is really that I was attracted to working on water because it integrates everything. I think it was just my indecisiveness of not knowing exactly what to study or focus on. And in fact, 25-ish years ago, started working on the Colorado River, more or less in the same job that I still have today, and just fell in love with the issues and with the mission of trying to take care of this river that does so much for us, but needs our help.
So my name is John Entsminger. I'm the general manager of the Southern Nevada Water Authority. The Water Authority is responsible for providing 100% of the water supply for about 76% of the state of Nevada's population, and we get 90% of our water from the Colorado River via Lake Mead. So a pretty important resource for the state of Nevada. I'm also the governor of Nevada's compact representative, so it's my job to negotiate with the other 6 states, the federal government, Mexico, other interested parties. And then on a personal level, I'm actually from Colorado. My mother's people are sugar beet farmers from Brush, and my father's folks are dryland farmers from up around Craig. So I spent most of my childhood hunting and fishing and stomping around just about every corner of the West Slope. So the river is a very personal issue for me.
And originally we were going to have a third panelist here, and that was Bidtah Becker, and she's the associate attorney for the Navajo Tribal Utility Authority. And unfortunately, her flights were canceled, and so she's not able to be here. So we'll do our best to kind of put in some points for her as well, because having the Native American voice is incredibly important in this. So also, the other voice that's incredibly important in this is the Colorado River. So I want to introduce the river very quickly. This is an international waterway that flows through 30 tribal nations, 7 U.S. states, the country of Mexico, and one of the 7 natural wonders of the world, the Grand Canyon. Over 40 million people rely on it for their drinking water. It supports hundreds of billions of dollars in annual economic activity, provides over 16 million jobs, it provides water for irrigation for 5.5 million acres of agriculture, and supplies hydroelectricity to over 4 million people. And it's a critical ecosystem that stretches from the Rocky Mountains, high in the Rocky Mountains, 1,400 miles down to the Sea of Cortez in Mexico. So this is an incredible river that does so much for everyone. And it's hard to believe that we're in a situation where we're dangerously close to running out of water. So Jennifer, can you help us understand how did we get here, starting with the Colorado River Compact?
Sure. I'm actually going to even back it up one more step, which is just to introduce the idea of prior appropriations. And probably some of you know what that is, but it's the concept that sometimes gets referred to as first in time, first in right. And it actually came about because in the early colonial settlement of the West, when people were setting up mine claims, if you had an operation going and you were using a little bit of water diverted from a creek to operate your stake, and then came back the next month or the next summer and found that the creek was dry, you might go uphill and find another mine uphill from you. And so to prevent people from shooting each other over that occurrence, there was a sort of principle of Western law that was established called prior appropriations that meant that the person who diverted the water first had the most senior right. And even if you were uphill, upriver, if you were going to divert that water, you couldn't deplete the person who got there first. So then to the compact, by the time we get to 1922, all 7 Colorado River Basin states are states. The upper basin states are Colorado, Utah, New Mexico, and Wyoming, and the lower basin states are California, Arizona, and Nevada. They, as 7 representatives, got together and decided that what they needed to do was to divide the river up for the use of their states. And so they set up this Colorado River Compact that effectively divided up the river into an upper basin and a lower basin, and unfortunately made that calculation of how much the basins could each get in an equitable distribution of water at a moment when the historic record, which was only about 20 or 30 years long at that point, was probably a little higher than the river has flowed over the long term. So from the get-go, the Colorado River Compact over-allocated the river. And I'll just make one more comment, which is that on the subject of equitable apportionment, they did divide the water back in 1922 between those 7 states into the upper basin group and the lower basin evenly, more or less. But they said at the time, well, we're not going to do anything about water for the tribes. It's in that document. And they said, we're not going to do anything about water for Mexico in that document. And perhaps to nobody's surprise, they didn't say a word about the environment and its own water needs. So I think from it's easy to sit here in 2023 and have a lot of opinions about that, but I'll share my opinion, which is that from a 21st century perspective, maybe that concept of equity is no longer fully there for us.
Thank you. And along those lines, can you also just explain, you have the first in time, first in right, but also the use it or lose it concept.
Oh, yes, sorry. One other good concept, which is that if you're not using your water, you don't continue to have the right to it. So it's actually been pointed out often that it's a perverse incentive, because while we have plenty of water conservation technology in pretty much every sector developed all over the world, there are arid places, people have figured out how to do more with less water under a property rights construct of prior appropriations. With this use it or lose it concept, your incentive is to use as much water as you can, because otherwise you lose that right. And if somebody's going to come along sometime in your future and want to buy the water from you, if you're not using it all, you can't actually sell it. So yet another interesting concept from Western water law.
Thank you. And John, can you help us understand where we are today with the current negotiations? We've heard about it in the news, and you've been in the thick of it.
Sure. I want to add just a few things on to what Jennifer said, and then I'll kind of move into the more recent past. And the first one was most of the motivation for entering into the compact in the first place, especially from the state of Colorado, was to avoid the application of prior appropriation across state lines. There's a Supreme Court case, Colorado v. Wyoming, that was decided in 1901 that said prior appropriation does apply across state lines in favor of Wyoming, and that really freaked Colorado out. So they wanted to enter into this compact so that they would know how much water they have that they knew they weren't going to develop for decades while California was rapidly developing the river. So that was a big part of getting into the compact. But as you see over the decades, up until just earlier this year and how it was being applied in draft federal environmental compliance documents, prior appropriation is still right there in our face, being applied across state lines. So our forefathers, the drafters of the compact, they kind of missed the boat on really, not having prior appropriation apply across state lines. And then just one thing, for the Native communities, and clearly I'm in no place to speak on their behalf, and I won't pretend to, but I do find it one of the great ironies of the doctrine of prior appropriation. We call it first in time and first in right, and yet the tribes that have been here from time immemorial have junior water rights to people who settled the land in the late 19th century. So just one more shortcoming of the doctrine. So that's kind of the bad news, right? And the news stayed kind of bad through the 60s, 70s. The Colorado has often been referred to as the most litigated river in the world. And that was true in the 60s and 70s in Arizona v. California. And I mean, real knife fights between states and under original jurisdiction litigation in the US Supreme Court. But moving into the mid-90s, things started to change. And we've actually accomplished a fair amount over the last 25 to 30 years that should give us some reason for hope. Starting primarily with the execution of the interim surplus guidelines right at the end of the second Clinton administration, which tells you, or should tell you, just how quickly things have changed on this river. I mean, there's probably some young folks in the audience that weren't here for the second Clinton administration, but most of the people I'm looking at remember that administration really well. And we were still dividing up, quote unquote, extra water. We weren't grappling with the fact that climate change was going to give us an entirely different river moving into the 21st century. But nevertheless, 7 states came together, they agreed upon those negotiated guidelines, we got them signed, and they became law. Same thing moving into the quantification settlement agreement in California, where they really started to balance the overuse of California's Colorado River demands, which gave us a lot of momentum into the 2007 guidelines, which for the first time really coordinated the operations between Lake Mead and Lake Powell, gave us some ability to conserve water and bank it for future use, so getting away from that strict application of use it or lose it that Jennifer talked about. Entered into a number of what are known as minutes, which are essentially addendums to the 1944 treaty between the United States and Mexico, Minute 319, Minute 323, really groundbreaking transboundary cooperative agreements. I have a copy of Minute 319 in my office that's been translated into Russian because it's being used as an example in other parts of the world for how you can come up with these collaborative transboundary solutions to water, and then really culminating in the drought contingency plan that passed Congress in 2019 with NGO support, with tribal support, and passed Congress 535-0, right? Which you point me, they can't rename a post office these days, 535-0. So the fact that we got a major river deal through Congress like that really does show a high level of cooperation. But the challenge now is all of that good work over the last 25 years or so, it all expires at the end of 2026. And all of our operations revert to what's known as long-range operating criteria under 68 statute. So it's just one of these things where we've done great work. We've demonstrated that there all are alternatives to litigation that we've seen in so many other river basins. But the challenge that's ahead of us now isn't one of these short-term fixes. The '07 guidelines were great. They were purposely designed to learn lessons over a 20-year period and then apply those lessons into more durable, longer-lasting solutions more out towards mid-century. The DCP was purposely calibrated to get us through the end of 2026. But now we need multi-decadal, durable solutions on this river. And the first thing we have to agree to is how bad of a river are we willing to negotiate to? Because we have 16.5 million acre feet of water in legal entitlements, right? So if you add up all 7 states, country, Mexico, and then you have another 2 million in evaporation system losses. So you're dealing with the needs, the rights, the entitlements, right? For 18.5 million acre feet, and the 20th century gave us 15 million. So we're in a hole from the jump, and the best climate scientists in the world, our Brad Udalls or Jonathan Overpecks, they won't tell you that 11 by mid-century is the worst case scenario. So we have to decide what sort of worst case scenario in terms of a warmer, drier future we're willing to negotiate to as a first step in moving into the future. Which brings us sort of to present day. And what's going on right now is last year in the Senate, the Commissioner of Reclamation said that we need to reduce permanently 2 to 4 million acre feet of uses. The states face planted in spectacular fashion during 22 and 23 and delivered absolutely nothing in terms of a tangible plan for moving forward with that. Fortunately, Mother Nature kind of bailed us out for 1 year and gave us a really wet water year, which gives us a reprieve, not a pardon, in terms of being able to get back to the negotiating table and move that forward. And now the lower basin states have put together a lower basin proposal to be analyzed. Really, again, another stopgap that'll hopefully get us to the end of 26, but it's imperative that not just the states, but our tribal partners, our environmental partners, get back to the table and start to figure out these longer term issues.
Great, thanks. And one of those things that is unquantified is a lot of the tribal water rights, which you mentioned my understanding of them is that they are some of the most senior rights, but then you said some of them are the most junior rights. So can you briefly qualify that?
Well, and I do think one mistake we make when we're talking, about our tribal partners is treating them as a homogenous block. They tell us repeatedly, if you know one tribe, you know one tribe, because there are tribes that have, water rights with an 1868, priority date. There are other tribes that entered into their settlements in 2006, and if you go by a strict priority, they're going to be cut to zero before some other tribes and a lot of agricultural interests have to reduce by 1 gallon. So it's not a simple issue even amongst those 30 tribes.
Yeah, which is really interesting because when you get down to it, there is a lot of cooperation, but there's also a lot that has been, we have like environment versus people, agriculture versus municipal, United States versus the tribes. So, a lot of this has led to the need for some pretty tense negotiations. So how do you see moving forward that we could think about this a little bit differently?
You want her? Me?
Is that for me?
Well, Jennifer, why don't you, John, I'd like you to talk about this from the perspectives, but then Jennifer, maybe you could talk about it from the voice of the river.
Well, first and foremost, I personally reject this distinctions between sectors, right? That we are going to come at this from here's the agricultural sector's interests, here's the municipal interests, here's the industrial interests, here's the environmental interests. I deliver water to 76% of the state's population in Nevada. They all eat food too, right? They all like the idea of being able to take a river trip down the Grand Canyon. So dividing us into these false, little boxes leads to more dysfunction than simply acknowledging that we need to look at the river as a whole. There are 40 million people that aren't going anywhere. And there's probably going to be more than 40 million people by mid-century. And you need to acknowledge the reality of that. But if you ever want this river to reach the ocean again, you need to have that as part of the formula for how you're going to design your systems. If you're not going to abandon your rural communities, you need to figure out how to make massive investments so that they can grow the same or more food using less water, which happens in other parts of the world all the time. So if you only start off by saying we have to dry up agriculture so cities can have more water, you're never going to reach success. You have to approach it from what do we want the entire system to look like, and what are our pathways towards achieving that?
So I agree. And I think one of the challenges we've had, and partly this perspective goes back to the 25 years ago when I started doing this work, but in part I say it is still quite valid today, which is that John's a good friend of mine, but the people who represent the states in the negotiations and even the federal government tend to be looking out for those parties who have the water rights. Those are the ones who are in their ears the most, have the political power, and I really haven't yet seen the states come forward with proposals or even contemplation of ways that environmental needs on the river can be addressed until we have been able to show them, define a problem for them in a way that can be solved. I mean, and to be fair, sort of that's our job as environmental advocates. I will say that we do have environmental laws in this country, but there's really only one that tends to get used to drive environmental management on the river, and that's the Endangered Species Act. And so it's quite limited in its reach. In the upper Colorado River Basin, it does bear on how some of the dams are operated in terms of flows that are released. In the lower basin, that is not true at all. And the approach has been to build habitat, to do the work that the river used to do in terms of expanding out onto the floodplain and developing its own riparian habitat. Instead, we're doing as people. And we're doing that in the US under the Endangered Species Act. We're actually now also doing it in Mexico through the negotiated binational agreement that John mentioned. But back to the point about sort of, where does the environmental voice come from for the river? I would say that it takes the environmental advocates, and it takes actually it takes a grassroots voice as well. And I'm not saying that every citizen's letter to reclamation during a comment period is what actually moves things, but I think the elected leaders who ultimately have decision responsibility for these interstate agreements are sensitive to public perception, and I've seen that happen. So I would say the public voice is a part of that as well.
And one question somebody proposed, we've all seen pictures of Lake Powell and Lake Mead and how low they've become in these last few years, so much to the point where they may go below the point where the outtake valves are to let water out. So, what's the backup plan if the lake levels drop so low that we aren't able to let water pass the dam? What's the backup plan if we have no drinking water?
I can certainly answer for Nevada. Well, there's two. So the plumbing is different at Powell than it is at Mead, because if Powell drops below what's called minimum power pool, you can't. That's because it's called minimum power pool, because you can no longer move water through the main tunnels into the generators. So you lose 1,400 megawatts of hydropower, like that, which is a big deal for our country because that's our last remaining black start capability, which I won't get too into, but you should be worried about that. but there's still bypass tubes, right? So you can get some amount of water, be it 6 million, 6.5 million, quite a bit less than the lower basin's using right now, but you can still move enough water downstream from Powell to Meade to meet health and human safety concerns. I don't really see, unless it absolutely goes dry, then you're not going to be in a scenario like that.
But what about Lake Mead? Because I noticed that Nevada put their
Yeah, well, Lake Mead doesn't have bypass tubes. So if you get to, and Lake Mead, we went into this century with Lake Mead so these elevations I'm going to say are all above sea level, right? So Lake Mead was about 1,210 feet above sea level. Today, and it was full, right? Today, it's at 1046. So you've dropped, 150, 160 feet, and it's at 30% capacity. If it drops down to 900, that's the elevation at which no water can physically pass through Hoover Dam. So that means all of central Arizona, 5 million people in Maricopa County, 19 million people in coastal California, 2 states in Mexico are cut off from access to the Colorado River. And up until we had this good winter, there were modeling projections that were showing a 15, 20% chance of that occurring within the next 10 years. So this is not like our grandchildren's problem. But as Tilly mentioned, because we sit on the shore of Lake Mead, we have conveniently installed our lowest intake at elevation 850. So we're going to have a nice big water column over our intake for Las Vegas. So don't worry about us.
And I think, when I think about sort of the risks on the river, the first thing that comes to my mind is the final 100 miles of this river that are sitting downstream from the furthest downstream dam that's right at the U.S.-Mexico border, and that is a reach of the river that has flowed in very few years in the last half century because there hasn't been enough water to reach down there. So we know we're using this river to extinction. The delta dried out. That was a 2 million acre ecosystem that actually Aldo Leopold wrote about in Sand County Almanac in an essay called Green Lagoons, if any of you remember that. And he described it as this incredibly lush landscape, and the river was so vast and spread out over the alluvial floodplain that you couldn't even tell which direction it was flowing. That is a dry landscape at this point, but for some very modest efforts that some of my Mexican NGO partners are making to put habitat back on the ground. But back to the point of, can we lose our water supply? You bet. And I've already seen it happen. And it happened in Mexico. And by the way, there's a tribe in Mexico that is, hauling water in buckets, not to mention tribes in the US that are hauling water in buckets.
Yeah, and that actually brings up an interesting point about water as a human right. And so, a Native American home is 19 times more likely to lack the plumbing for clean drinking water and wastewater than a white home. And on the Navajo Nation, these are all from Bidtah, 30% of the Navajo Nation lacks access to clean drinking water in their homes. And can you just speak briefly to that as water is a human right?
Well, I think it caught many of our attention during COVID when the highest mortality rates in the United States were on the Navajo Nation. And I think there's a direct link. When the public health advice you're getting is to wash your hands all the time, and yet 30% of the households don't have running water, then clearly there's, we haven't seen the studies, but I have jumped to the conclusion that there's a linkage there. And it's sort of stunning that in this country we still have vast areas where people don't have access to running water in their homes. And, there are particular challenges for tribes. Navajo Nation itself extends over 3 different states. They have water in 3 different states and don't have an easy time developing a water supply that they might be able to develop in one state, delivering it across a state line to their citizens who just happen to live over the state line. So this kind of goes back to this historic set of laws that we have inherited, none of us put them in place, we've inherited them, and for a very long time, we have sort of allowed them to govern what we can and can't do. And I think that at this moment, as climate change is challenging so much of everything that we had set up on the Colorado River as a system of water supply in this region, that it's time to re-examine not only what we need to do to make sure that Las Vegas and LA and Tucson, all the cities across the Southwest and all the farms get their water, but to address some of the issues that are sort of the hangover from some of those laws that were put in place that didn't address equity issues for tribes and didn't address water needs for the environment.
Great. Well, this is kind of a dismal picture. So what are, this is a question of humanity, as we're seeing, and survival. So in the end, in our outsized discussions, we've talked about, we can make all these laws, but ultimately we will be under the law of Mother Nature and what Mother Nature delivers us as water supply. So assuming that climate change and less water are going to be the norm moving forward, what are the solutions that you see? And John, I'll let you lead off with this.
Okay. No, I'm glad that you frame it that way, because we're not necessarily that far away from the laws of physics, trumping the law of man. And I've made that point to my partners in California and Arizona, a number of times. They love running around showing off their senior water rights. And I tell them, those senior water rights don't trump the law of gravity. And I'm uphill. So, that's the way it works. But here's a bunch of Coloradans in the room. So this is a Colorado saying in water law, right? It's better to be upstream with a shovel than downstream with a water right? So, but here's the good news. This is all totally solvable. And it's really not that complicated. Every water user in every sector, in every state, has to use less water. And in Las Vegas, this may come as a surprise to some of you, we're a poster child for urban water conservation worldwide. We have added 850,000 new residents since 2002, and we've cut our water usage by 31%. We have grown and diversified our economy while simultaneously, materially, drastically reducing the amount of water. And it's not just on a net basis on the overall population, it's every person. We've reduced, in 2002, our community was using about 278 gallons per person per day. Last year we used 104. And that's outdoors, right? Vegas is a valley. We have to be able to water our trees, water some landscaping to combat urban heat island, to keep the air quality to appropriate levels. But in terms of indoor use, we have a couple of major strategic disadvantages on the river. First and foremost, according to lore, the Nevada negotiator in the 20s was a drunk and he was at the bar during the whole thing, which was how we wound up with a robust 1.8% of the legal entitlements to the Colorado River, right? We provide 90% of the water supply for 76% of the state's population with 1.8% of the river. And we're only using 2/3 of that. So we're not a big water user, but we've led the way and we've banned evaporative cooling. We've mandated through state law the removal of all non-functional turf. If it's not a smart piece of grass for your kid or grandkids to be playing on, it's out in Las Vegas. And that same ethic, those same best practices are beginning to translate across the urban sector. We signed, it's Assembly Bill 356 that banned the non-functional turf. Our governor signed that in June of 2021. By November of 2022, 30 cities in the Colorado River Basin had pledged to take out at least 30% of their non-functional turf. So these solutions are right there. They're expensive and they take political will, which in this day and age, both of those things can be in rather short supply. But if you have the willingness to adapt to the reality of a warmer, drier future, we think our water usage left unabated will go up by 9 gallons per person per day by 2035 just because of warmer local temperatures. Nothing to do with anything else in the basin. We spend an inordinate amount of time talking about the impacts of climate change on the supply side of the equation. We spend almost no time talking about the impacts of climate change on the demand side of the equation. If every person in Las Vegas is going to use 9 gallons per person more because of warmer temperatures by the mid-2030s, how much more water is it going to take to irrigate 5 million acres of irrigated agriculture unless we make it a national obligation? And I mean like akin to Eisenhower's efforts to build the national highway system. That's the kind of national mobilization it's going to take to get our food security in line with the realities of the amount of water we are going to have to apply in the agricultural sector. But it's all solvable. At the end of the day, we're going to use the amount of water that Mother Nature gets us. It's a matter of, are we going to adapt to that quickly, or are we going to punt our responsibilities and let the guys and gals in black robes tell us the solutions?
Jennifer, do you have anything to add?
Well, I agree with all of John's ideas for solutions there, and I'll add just a couple, which is one is sort of nature-based solutions, natural distributed storage. We're losing snowpack in the Rockies, and that's a natural reservoir for water. And so there are people beginning to experiment with putting in either literally beavers into some of the valleys or what we call beaver dam alternatives, which are just like a little man-made handmade beaver dam that's pulling up some of the water, very low head structures. These aren't big dams, they're just little in the bottom of the valley. But then you're recharging groundwater, you're keeping water higher up in the watershed, and you're creating wildlife habitat. So it's a replacement for some of that lost storage. That's another place where I think investment can help us. And, we all love this region, those of us who live here. We want to see it remain a wonderful place with a wonderful quality of life. And I think there are, as John said, there are ways that we can have a good life here. I'll pivot for just a minute and say it's the investments, but there's also, I think, a possibility in solutions that was demonstrated in the 2 U.S.-Mexico agreements that John mentioned he has a copy of in Russian on his wall, which took a host of issues, including sharing surpluses and sharing shortages, but also creating investments in irrigation infrastructure, also expanding provisions for Mexico to be able to store some of their water in U.S. reservoirs, which in the past was considered crazy idea because Mexico didn't pay to build those reservoirs. But now that the reservoirs are really empty, it looks like a better idea to have them store some of their water there. And under the framework of those agreements, the U.S. and Mexico, having watched the Delta dry out, I'm not going to point a finger. It wasn't one country's fault or the other's. It just sort of happened on everybody's watch. But the 2 countries did decide to begin some work restoring with commitments of both water and dollars to try to put habitat back on the ground and occasionally flowing river back on the landscape. And so I do think when there are multiple parties in these really complex negotiations, sometimes having more pieces of the puzzle to fit together actually makes it easier to solve than if you're really only just focused on how are we going to use less water going forward and who's going to use how much less.
Great. And and just real briefly, because I want to leave time for questions, but what can we as individuals do? I think everybody in here, we have all these values of water, but there's also the value of the river and the water because we feel good around it, and we all enjoy the river and various bodies of water, but what can we as individuals do that will make a dent?
Well, I guess the first thing I would say, I think the most important thing at the individual level is awareness. I mean, do you guys have any idea what your water footprint is? Because your cell phone is a water hog. A data center, at least in Las Vegas and most of the Southwest, one data center uses enough water through evaporative cooling as a golf course. But there are now technologies, and one's being built in Las Vegas. It's called Nova, is a new data center, $400 million investment that has a zero water footprint. So at the entrepreneurial level, at the at the investment level, at the hedge fund level, prioritizing the awareness of how are you using water. When you're drinking a glass of milk, that alfalfa is being grown with Colorado River water, and it's using a lot of it. And I'm not going to pick on ag, because I've said we need to balance and not have distinctions between sectors, but ag uses 80% of the water. So we're going to have to figure out a way to support our beef industry, support our dairy industry, and simultaneously use less water. But do you as an individual, are you aware of how you're using water? Because unless you are, lack of awareness means no behavioral change. And that means each individual is not going to be part of the overall solution.
I'll add a little bit to that, and I'll say, yes, individual awareness, very important, and just conversation with your neighbors. But I'll also point out that if you do have a passion for all life, which is 70% of the wildlife in the arid West that depends on rivers, if you have a passion for that, there are Audubon and other environmental organizations do have ways for you to engage as involved or uninvolved as you want, everything from local volunteer groups that get involved in policy issues to just your standard online collectivism. So if you want to engage in any of those ways, we welcome that. And I would say vote like you believe climate change is real, because we can juggle these balls, and we can't, there's a long way to go on water conservation. We're just getting going in the Colorado River Basin, but we can't do it indefinitely. And I don't think any of us want to live on the planet where we have to do it indefinitely. So we have to get a handle on that.
Can I say one more thing?
Yeah.
Sorry,
Why
I
don't
don't
if
know
each
what
of you
our time
have
is.
we're at time for questions. So if you have one idea you want to wrap up with.
Okay, the last thing I want to say, because we're in Aspen, I don't know, there might be a hedge fund manager or two in here. ESG metrics. ESG metrics are a course tool. They're developed to be applied worldwide, regardless of which particular ecosystem you're in being applied. That's the wrong way to go about it. We need to be able to calibrate those to a localized level down into municipal, county level codes, because in Las Vegas, we can generate more power. We can't generate more water. So what the electric consumption of a new development is almost immaterial when it comes to ESG metrics. But what the water footprint of that new development is obviously critical. And we're getting to a point where our new development is getting very close to not just zero, but a negative water footprint. In the last 3 years, we've had 47,000 new connections in Las Vegas. And a connection can be a new casino, it could be a new house, right? So about 47,000 new connections valley-wide over the last 3 years, and we've reduced our water footprint by 12% in that 3 years. This can be done.
Do you have any last minute? No. Okay, so we'll go ahead and take questions. We have somebody roaming around with a mic. And I'd invite you to get to the heart of the matter and keep your questions short so that we can get in as many as possible. Gentleman over here in the front row.
Thank you. I'm so glad, John, that you brought up the water footprint of something like this. He's referring to the water energy nexus or a data center, water required for cooling the data center and for making the energy to that. So a lot of people are really confused or detached from, divorced from that water energy nexus. And I think that, would you agree, that we need policy? I mean, yes, talk to your neighbors. Yes, make some personal changes. But would you agree that expecting voluntary actions, we're not going to get big changes through voluntary actions, right? We need policy, energy policy. Do you agree? In order to evoke the changes needed?
September 1st, a moratorium on no new evaporative cooling in Las Vegas goes into place. Policy.
So yes, policy.
Great.
Absolutely.
The gentleman in the back there.
Yeah.
Yes. You, yes.
This is a national issue. Any solution is going to cost more money than any of us can imagine. The eastern United States is awash in water, catastrophic flooding. I'm going to leave desalination out of this. We have moved natural resources around this country for decades. Does anyone ever talk about building the infrastructure to move water from the eastern United States, from the southeast? There are articles being written that suggest the southeast will become over time a tropical rainforest because of climate change. Does anyone talk about moving water across this country so that we as a nation can all live?
Great, thank you.
People talk about it all the time and it goes nowhere. One of the biggest challenges, there's a lot of water in some years. In other years, there's very little water. I don't know if you saw pictures of the Mississippi last year. There were places people were walking across it. And the number one issue on the Mississippi is navigation. You got to be able to move those cargo ships from New Orleans to St. Louis. And if you take a bunch of water out, there's not as much water in the Mississippi as you think there is.
But there's a whole area east of the Mississippi River.
Yeah, we're going to move on to the next question. Let's see, I'm going to go gentleman in the green hat over here, and then the gentleman in the blue shirt.
Real quick, people want to have an experience of the Colorado River. Talk to Tilly about going on one of her trips. Quick question: microhydro, is that a
What's the
solution?
question?
And how much can we actually solve the problem by reducing our consumption of almonds and having hemp milk instead of almond milk, and reducing our consumption of meat?
Yeah. Microhydro, he's talking about putting miniature hydro turbines and down gradient pipelines. It's a very small fraction of the overall electrical needs. You're not going to save the world by not buying almonds. It's forage crops. 80% of the water goes to agriculture. 80% of that 80% is forage crops. It's alfalfa, it's Sudan grass. We got to grow the grass more efficiently. And meats, cows eat alfalfa.
Gentleman in blue shirt.
Thanks. So you mentioned ESA briefly, but aside from that, can you discuss what role land management agencies play in the negotiations? So Forest Service, BLM, state level Colorado Parks and Wildlife, and wondering if they might be sort of the voice of the river or the ecological voice that sounds like maybe is missing in some of this?
That's a great question, and I will point out that we have some major national park units on the rivers of the Colorado River Basin, and they barely have a voice at the table, barely. They are a cooperating agency within the Department of Interior, but they are definitely at the kids' table.
Any other questions? Time for one more. The woman in the front here.
Have there been discussions about preventing evaporation and then also leaks within the ditches?
Yes, and that's been done on some fairly big scale. It's not all small scale. A lot of off-stream banking. One of the best ways to preserve water, and if you have the right geology, is to take water off the river, inject it into those aquifers, and it's there for future use. We've done that in our aquifer in Las Vegas. It's been done in Arizona. But when the reservoirs are critically low, like they are now, you also don't want to be taking water out of the river to be putting it in there. So I'm sorry, I missed the last part of your question.
Preventing leakage.
Leakage, yeah, and that, we refer to that as the efficiency conundrum. Like when we lined the All-American Canal, the All-American Canal is the biggest diversion off the Colorado River, and it was an earthen, canal. And for decades, almost a century, that canal had been leaking, the water percolating under the border and creating some wetlands on the Mexican side of the border. You come in, you line the canal, save that water, you transfer it from IID to San Diego, wetlands, gone. So every drop of water is being used somewhere. If you're going to use water more efficiently one place, you're going to stop that water from getting to another place.
And I'll also just point out that the environment is basically the inadvertent user of all that inefficiency. So I'm not saying all efficiency is bad, but if we're going to pursue that, we need better provisions for secure water supply for environmental resources.
And we might have time for one more very brief question. Okay, the woman whose arm shot up.
Hi.
Very brief question.
Thank you very much for mentioning the need to reduce our actual consumption. is there any way that we can think about this burden of reduction so that it is distributed not equally but equitably, considering that marginalized, poor, indigenous, black, brown communities tend to hold the burden of this reduction while also enjoying the least amount of water and the most contaminated environments? And sorry, but as we have the promise of so-called green technologies, oftentimes these actually consume a ton of water, particularly so-called green hydrogen, as well as lithium extraction. Is this a concern for you as we kind of vest our interest in continuing production towards so-called green technologies that are hurting us in different ways?
I mean, I'll take the point about equity in communities, and I think you heard me say it earlier, which is that as we are taking a hard look at water use, thinking about enormous investments that are going to be needed, thinking about restructuring how we share the river, I think it is very much on people's minds at this moment that we have an opportunity to make sure in an urban context that people have access to a basic amount of household water, but that maybe have a tiered rate structure and the highest rates are going to the people who have giant properties. And at the same time, even for those communities that don't have access to water, and I'm talking particularly now about the tribes, that there are ways that they might be included, but we have to figure that out at the same time that we're figuring out how to use less water, because that part's not optional. The water's just not there.
And I'm happy to stay after and explain in more detail, if you'd like, just our rate structure and how we deal with affordability, particularly below the poverty line. But I would suffice it to say, the very, very rich people in Las Vegas are far and away the most angry with me right now.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you to the Ideas Festival. And I want to leave us with one little quote from Sylvia Earle. There's plenty of water in the universe without life, but nowhere is there life without water. So thank you guys for being here.